Welcome to Maps and Meta-Analysis.
Looking at California cities. Hi, I'm Darvesh Borja.
And I'm Justin Hirsch, and this is Facts and Folsom.
A meta-analysis.
Hey guys, welcome to episode 14 of Maps and Meta-Analysis, this season being Facts and Folsom. So this week was a city council meeting, so we're going to go over that. Justin and I didn't stay for the whole meeting, so we relied a bit on the recording of the meeting. So kind of the broad strokes were the rodeo got announced. There was another CEQA appeal by a Folsom resident. Should we say their name? Or?
I would just say
Okay, I don't think we said it last time, so we'll just avoid saying it. But if you're in the city of Folsom, or you can find this all in the additional information packet, but we don't want to make their name any more known than is already in public documents.
Yeah.
Then there was also there was a PBID that was approved. We'll go over what a PBID is and the kind of process there. There was also some appointments, I believe, to various commissions throughout the city. So things like the Planning Commission, Traffic Safety Commission, Parks and Rec Commission, and then I think there was like some standby votes. I wasn't paying too much attention to the voting process, but we could talk about that a bit, and what the process like was, what the factors were that were considered for each applicant, and what the city council was debating. I think those are kind of the big topics. There was also there was a traffic safety, I believe, presentation.
Workshop.
Workshop. Yeah, so they basically discuss where are the areas in Folsom with the most accidents in the last few years. They gave some historical context of, for example, how many of them were fatal accidents, how many of them were different types of collisions. Some clarifications on the categorization. For example, like the majority of them are labeled as, or I wouldn't say the majority, but the plurality are labeled as unsafe speed. But there's some clarification there, so we'll get into that. I think those are the kind of big topics. I listed those a bit out of order, but you can refer to like the city council agenda to see the actual like ordering of things. But they were also pulled out of order anyway, so I'm not sure the order really matters.
Well, I mean, at least it started out in order. I think procedurally you have to start with like a roll call and then public comment. So it was really just everything after consent calendar was flipped around, where I believe it was inverted, where it started at the very bottom and then worked its way up to the appeal about the cabin at that point.
Yeah. So without further ado, I guess we'll just kind of get into it. What do you want to start with?
Well, actually, I think it's worth talking about the public comment this week, because there were several people from the public that wanted to respond to previous comments that have been made, particularly from the mayor, with regards to the unhoused population. And you had several groups that came out to support those commenters, and I believe at least two of them were actually off-duty police officers that wanted to push back on the idea that the unhoused issue isn't something that's significantly impacting the apartment. They felt that the number and the severity of the calls was higher than that as conveyed by the mayor in previous meetings. So they came to voice their concern about that, as well as saying that internally their department has contradictory statistics.
I think the basic accusation was that the mayor specifically and the city council in general were being somewhat flippant about the unhoused issue, and that they were essentially like not taking it as seriously as they should, and sort of just writing it off as like, well, it's not that bad, so that's why we can make the decision the way we did. I think it's worth taking their comments at face value, because they are police officers. Like, I've never been on a ride along, that Justin's never been in a ride along, and one of their claims, which I thought was pretty fair, was that the mayor shouldn't make any judgments just based on one ride along with one police officer on one day. That may not be a representative sample of what happens on like a given week or a given month or a given year. So I think those concerns were totally valid. I guess the only contention I really had was that I think the city council was very conscientious of this, and I think their claim was that given a fixed budget and a fixed set of resources, and the fact that the chief of police came up and was asked point blank, like, is there an emergency, and they said no, suggests that given the constraints, this was maybe the best path forward. And also the fact that 2 extra CSO officers were approved that actually dipped into the unassigned fund balance, or basically like the rainy day fund, seems like an indication that the council members are actually kind of more in favor of increasing police staffing in general. So, you know, they kind of err on the side of overstaffing rather than erring on the side of understaffing. And, you know, they have their kind of reasons for it, which we've discussed on previous episodes.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's kind of where I stand on it. Is I don't think they were being flippant. I think they were just making the best decision considering the totality of the budget and everyone's concerns and, you know, kind of the fiscal health of Folsom as a whole. I don't know, what did you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't see any reason not to take what either party says at face value. That being said, I do think it would be nice to see those statistics being referenced by either side of the argument, side by side, how they came to those conclusions, rather than just referencing, oh, we have statistics to support the claim. I think that would be helpful because in the absence of it, people are very likely to rely on their own biases, perhaps what their own eyes are seeing, like when they go home or they drive to work, to say, oh, I fall on one side or the other, rather than getting a holistic perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. And I definitely agree with the idea of having more data. So this kind of fits in with my personal theme of making a lot of this data publicly accessible. Yeah, I think with police reports and things, that's probably a bit difficult because there's a level of privacy concern that you have to keep in mind. You know, to what extent do you actually de-anonymize things? You know, what information is actually relevant for understanding this, you know, these kind of issues in an aggregate way that protects people's anonymity if they, you know, want to be anonymous. But I think, yeah, I'm sort of imagining like an API that people could, you know, plug different apps into. I mean, Folsom apps being one of them, or, you know, anyone could maybe build like a dashboard or something of like, you know, real-time crime statistics in Folsom or something like that. And it'd be nice if everyone was referring to the same set of data. Maybe not presented in the same way, but at least the same underlying source of data. And if different people could present it in different ways, I think that would benefit everyone as far as like making a decision. Because I think right now it's just like, you don't value this, I value this, you know, our sort of value systems are unaligned, and I don't know, it doesn't seem like a sustainable way to govern, I think, in the long term. You know, not just for this unhoused issue, but, you know, just sort of like on anything. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I don't know, it's kind of all I have to say for that.
Okay. Moving on, the next thing was, as Jarvis mentioned, there was a proclamation by the mayor proclaiming July 1st through 3rd as the Western Rodeo Days, so the Folsom Rodeo. And during that proclamation, actually, she mentioned that, was this the longest held rodeo in the West? Something to that effect.
That honestly might have been the case. Because, yeah, I think it's been going on for like 60 years or something like that. So, yeah, definitely super long. I mean,
that surprised me. Like, I did not expect that.
Yeah, exactly. Because I know Folsom really started blossoming around like the 90s. You know, I think like Intel moved here, and, you know, that's when everything started growing at a much faster pace. But obviously, Folsom as a town still existed in some capacity, you know, all the way back to the Gold Rush days. So
yeah, it was certainly influential back then. Like, we were one of the major like thoroughfares to Sacramento.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. I guess it made sense in retrospect, but yeah, it was a bit surprising. So yeah,
being a proclamation, I mean, that was more or less just the extent of it. So the rodeo days themselves are July 1st through 3rd, that weekend, and then they moved on to the consent calendar next. Nothing super controversial came out of there. A couple of items were pulled, but the discussion based on it was, I would say it's fair to say non-substantive because they weren't really amended at all. They were all passed. And then following that is where the agenda started to get mixed up a little bit. They did start with the public hearing, item number 13, which kind of they didn't finish and they came back to, because what that one was, as listed on the agenda, resolution 13 was a resolution of the City Council of the City of Folsom declaring the results of the majority protest proceedings and renewing the historic Folsom property and business improvement district, approving the assessment formula and levying the assessments. So all of that, basically the context is, several years ago, I believe it was 2013, the Folsom Historic District was renewed for a 10-year period, which was the maximum at the time for a renewal of a historic district. And being 2023, it's coming towards the end of the renewal. So the Historic Commission came, presented, said, hey, like, we want another 10-year renewal. And then the relevant process that goes behind that is, after the presentation, there had been ballots sent to, I believe, the major business owners in the historic district where they had to vote on whether or not they would pay towards a historic district fund. And based on that and the city council's own fundraising, the votes had to be counted from those business owners during the meeting. So that was being done. And then once the tally was collected, that's when this item was later revisited. Do you think I missed anything there?
No, yeah, I think you got the mechanics of it, but maybe just to back up for a second. So, there's a PBID. So, what does that stand for? It's like property. Is it property and business investment or improvement district? Or, do you remember what did the agenda items say? Because I think it defined the acronym.
I'll find it. You can keep going.
Okay, so yeah, I'll refer to it as a PBID, and then I'll just clarify what the name is itself later, or like what the acronym actually stands for. But basically, it's a way for a certain geographic area or like a subset of a city to kind of collectively pool some money in order to provide services for that geographic area that are in addition to the regular city, the regular like city services. So as a concrete example, because this is the historic district, they, for example, have maybe extra requirements, let's say for street sweeping, or maybe they want to install kind of extra decorative lighting that wouldn't be covered by the kind of like landscaping commission by the city of Folsom. So instead of going to the city and asking for extra money in the budget as like a line item to do all these things, what the kind of business owners do is they say, hey, let's collectively kind of pool our money together, and the amount of say you have and is kind of proportional to the assessed value of your business, as a proportion of the total assessed value of that area. So the concrete example that was given was that, let's say there's $100,000 worth of property value and you own $10,000 worth of it, you account for 10% of the vote for that district whenever it comes to renewing the actual contract itself, or making any sort of kind of executive decision on behalf of that organization. And the way this works is essentially these taxes are all paid to the county. The county does not take any sort of cut or percentage of them. They are simply kind of an intermediary.
They administrate it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They administrate it, and then the money sort of gets dispersed back to the PBID in a it's basically like a big fund, and that they can draw from that fund and use it for any sort of extra projects that they want or any extra ongoing expenses that are not covered by the city of Folsom. And the idea is that if you want an area to have a higher than normal amount of service, then it's the business owners who pay into that because ultimately they're the ones that benefit. So it's a very like, it's very like anarcho system to some extent. It's like a very, collectivist, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I would also be interested now, after hearing that discussion, and especially with the weighting of the votes, to see if there's like a landowner that like has a large disproportionate share of that vote and effectively controls the vote, versus it being a little more equitable, maybe a bunch of different businesses in the same price range. My hunch would be the latter, rather than it just being one landowner that basically like can steamroll their way through, but don't have the data. And getting back to your initial question about what PBID stands for, PBID itself stands for Property and Business Improvement District, but this specific PBID is a HF PBID, and that stands for Historic Folsom Property and Business Improvement District.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Oh, one other detail is when the county disperses the money, they have to disperse it to a nonprofit organization that is in charge of the PBID. So it's not like sort of evenly divvied out to the business owners themselves. There's a nonprofit organization. The nonprofit organization has its own staffing and things like that, and then the businesses kind of interface with that nonprofit, who gets the money from the county, which the businesses initially paid, and that's kind of how that funding system works. So there's kind of a different mechanism of accountability within that is sort of separate from what the city has to offer. And I guess they ultimately decide, what the tax rate is, how much they want to pay into this fund. All those things are made in a, very bottom-up way, I would say.
Do you happen to know what the results of that was? Even though that came later in the meeting, I think thematically you might as well address it now.
I actually don't know what the technical result was. I think they were pretty confident that it was going to get renewed. I think they said something like the city of Folsom owns like 40+%, or basically their weighted percentage, amounts to something like 40%. So it's not quite like a majority, but it's like pretty close, I guess.
Yeah, and that's where the city council votes as the representatives of the city.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think the last time it was renewed, it was like 78%. So it was like the vast majority of people seem to want this.
Well, especially I think with the revitalization of the historic district that has happened in recent years, I think it would be big news if that vote went the opposite way than was expected. So, probably safe to say that it inevitably was renewed.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and it's kind of a symbiotic relationship. I mean, it's the city of Folsom benefits because they're ultimately like one of the largest holders of buildings and land and stuff there. So, I thought the concept was quite interesting. I don't know, yeah, very like bottom-up collectivist stuff. This is honestly what I thought homeowners associations were for like the longest time. But I mean, that's a whole can of worms. But basically, like, I don't think homeowners associations are what they claim to be kind of at face value. I think a lot of them are, a lot of them are fine, honestly. Like, a lot of the ones in Folsom are like quite good. I know my parents, for example, like, they only pay like maybe $50-$60, in like their homeowners association fee like per month. So, which is fine. It's like there's tons of landscaping and stuff outside. So everyone kind of pools their reresources. That landscaping stays nice, and it's not the responsibility of any one homeowner. Like I totally understand that, but I don't know. It seems like HOAs can get kind of out of hand. I mean, I say this especially in New York City, where sometimes you can get an apartment and your HOA fee will be like more than your mortgage or something if you make like a large down payment.
Yeah.
Like I think I saw a condo that was like $500K or something, and pretty sure the HOA fee each month would be like $500 or $600.
Jeez.
So, and sometimes they claim that they're like, oh, we have like a doorman, and you're like, dude, there's like 100 apartments here. Like this is a lot of money to be collecting for like one doorman. So, yeah, I don't know, slight tangent, but that's kind of what it reminded me of. But this seems like a much healthier version of that.
Yeah. So. Moving on, this is where they really started to jump. So after item 13, they went all the way down to item 16 under old business, which was a resolution authorizing the formation of the River District Master Plan Citizens Advisory Committee. So this is what Darvish was mentioning earlier in the beginning about the city council voting on who would sit on that committee. And you had a combination of a recommended list of different interest groups and categories from which the city council could choose from, as well as 11 different at-large citizens of Folsom who applied to be on this. And the recommendation from the city staffer who was advising the city council was to go for a body of about 14 people as the sweet spot for being able to get like a representative body while also not being super unwieldy with a lot of people. However, the city council felt that it was more important to be inclusive of a wider perspective of opinions. And one of the most straightforward things that they did before going to a voting process was they just outright decided that they were going to take 2 from each of the listed recommended categories, with the exception of one of the categories, which, apologies, I don't remember. And then they decided to also take every single one of the citizens who applied. So all 11 citizens of Folsom that wanted to be a part of this initially became a part of it before even any voting took place. After that, I don't think there was anything like super controversial with the voting. There was some different priorities for sure, which maybe you might want to speak on. But aside from that, there were also a couple of people in the audience who took the opportunity to go up and advocate for others or themselves to be on it.
Yeah, I to be honest, I wasn't paying like too close of attention because it seemed like most people who applied sort of got in. Yeah, I don't know. It did seem like kind of like previous votes where some kind of personal connection to one of the city council members did seem to influence their decision one way or the other. And I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of a natural consequence of being in this kind of place, or I shouldn't say this kind of place, but more so nature of local government, right? It is very community oriented. These are not like highly paid positions or anything like that. So nobody's really doing this for any sort of monetary reason. They're doing it because they are kind of ideologically committed, or even just physically committed to living in Folsom one way or the other. So yeah, I don't know. It seemed like pretty passionate people overall. I don't know actually if any of them were in the crowd. It seems like they all just kind of maybe submitted their vote and maybe stayed. I don't know. I couldn't really tell.
Yeah, I think it's likely that at least a couple of them were in the crowd, just from the 11 at-large members, based on when people left. That being said, they didn't really speak up at that point.
Yeah, so interesting. I mean, definitely like a small d democratic process that's very good to see. And I don't know, like if you want to get involved, like there's a pretty statistically high chance that you might actually get selected, because typically they're a lot of these applications are kind of like underfilled. So I don't know, it's a good motivation. Like if you're in your local city, or if you're in Folsom, like go for it. And
often a barrier to entry for a lot of people is just the thought that, oh well, my opinion is not going to be valued, or I'm going to be outclassed by the other applicants. But I think the city of Folsom is a good counterexample to that. That, well, no, even if you don't have maybe like super relevant career experience, like you're like a retired civil engineer or something, your opinion is still important, and the city council takes it very seriously.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm sure, I mean, I can't obviously speak for other cities, but this seems like it would be the case in a lot of suburbs, where there's a very kind of vocal small group that ultimately has a very outsized sway on a much larger population. And so, I don't know, who knows? You could be part of that population and make a difference.
So after this item 16, went to item 15, which was that workshop regarding traffic safety, but specifically along the Folsom Lake corridor. So that runs from the intersection with Folsom Auburn Road down Folsom Lake Crossing, over a little bit of East Natoma, and then up through Green Valley to the edge of the city. Basically just hugging the outside of the dam.
I'll put a little like map screenshot here next to just like where I'm currently sitting, so that you guys can better visualize this. Yeah.
And that area in particular was of concern because there had been a lot of different accidents over the last few years. And in their workshop, they provided several images and broke down what each dot that they had put on it meant. I believe there were several different colors, with red representing fatalities, yellow representing different levels of like more serious accidents, and then I'm not sure how many other colors they included, but there were 2 fatalities in the last 3 years, I think, 4 years.
Something like that, yeah.
And a lot of the other identified accidents had been related to excess speed, as Darvish mentioned at the top of the video.
Yeah, it's I thought the metrics for measuring this stuff was actually quite good, because it was kind of normalized to the population, and also normalized to the number of miles driven. So I think it was like number of accidents per million miles driven or something like that, and yeah, it seems to be steadily increasing as Folsom grows, which suggests that it's not purely a function of the population growth, meaning like more people and like they get into accidents at the same rate, and so you're just seeing like a higher number, even normalized to the number of people and the number of miles driven. It does seem like these accidents are happening more frequently. They cited several different categories. Unsurprisingly, some of them are like DUIs. Some of them are just going too fast. Some of them are not respecting the right of way. So for example, there's oncoming traffic. You don't have the right of way to turn onto the street, but you sort of violate that right of way, and let's say the car behind you or ahead of you collides. So stuff like that would be a different category. I don't remember all the categories, but if you want to see them all, and you want to see like a pie chart of the breakdown, as well as like a map of where each collision happened, I think you can find that in the additional resources packet that's attached to the city council meeting agenda. Yeah,
and you can also. I'm not sure if the recording captures it, but you can at least hear them talking about it as well.
Yeah. I felt like I don't know if it was just the speaker, but it felt a bit dry for the gravity of the situation.
Especially since this has been a recurring conversation for several years now.
Yeah.
And one of the recommendations being to put a median in, especially right in front of the dam over the spillways, which it sounds like is moving forward. That being said, that has been a recommendation for a long time. And my understanding is that perhaps the ownership of the road and the responsibility for it has been a mitigating factor in why it's taken so long.
Yeah, and this also touches on a point that we actually made in a previous podcast episode. So a lot of the funding related to highway construction, especially as it regards safety, is dependent on how dangerous a certain area is. So how many fatalities does it have? How many accidents does it have? Normalized to the number of people and the number of miles driven. So it is more of a reactive system rather than a proactive system. So it's possible that this median was desired all along, and for jurisdiction reasons, or maybe just for funding reasons, you couldn't really justify funding that median because on paper it looked like, oh hey, nobody's driven on this road, so therefore no accidents have happened, so therefore it is a safe road, right? Like no accidents happen. Why would we need to prevent anything? So it's somewhat unfortunate that accidents do need to occur and almost like need to take place before the city and the Traffic Safety Commission can sort of generate a case for asking the federal government for funding to make it safer. That being said, I mean, on a proactive basis, like I don't know if the proactive way would be any better. The idea that you could make one place infinitely safe, at the expense of others, and not have any sort of data to back it up. So, yeah, I don't know. This is obviously not the best system, but I also don't know, what an alternative might look like that is kind of fair and equitable to people across the country.
Yeah, that's fair. I don't really have any more thoughts on that presentation. Do you have any? No, you're good?
No, not yet.
Okay, so the final item for the agenda was the appeal that we mentioned, which had to do with the demolition of a cabin on a property on Bridge Street, specifically that demolition as being exempt from CEQA as determined by the Historic District Commission. And this, admittedly, we were not there for. We had to leave beforehand. And we had listened to the recording for this portion, but the, I guess, broad gist that I'll give you was during the presentation, there was a significant back and forth regarding whether or not the applicant had standing to even bring an appeal forward. And this was largely based on the city council's definition of someone that's able to have standing is either the person who is, doing the project, the person who is just, I think, sold the project, sold the land.
Oh, I see. Like, basically, which parties are kind of even peripherally involved with the project?
Yeah. And then finally, the last category here was people who had a stake in the process such that their property usage would be affected, not property value. And that was something that the legal counsel for the city definitely made the distinction for. So there was a back and forth whether the applicant had standing to be there. The applicant did argue that as a resident of Folsom, there should be an inherent standing there, that pretty much everyone, especially in the same district, has a stake in the project. Whereas it sounded like largely the city council disagreed with that notion. And then by the time of the resolution, they ended up voting to deny the appeal, with the exception of they did add a couple more stipulations to the approval for the project. One of them being the preservation of the cabin as possible by offering a 30-day window for the developer before they demolish for someone to come pick it up somehow and take it away and preserve it, which they had discussed 90 days as a period, but then they ended up compromising to 30 as they both the demolition and the city council felt that was a reasonable time period. And then they also added another stipulation regarding whether or not the city would be sued, but I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to try to misquote that.
Yeah, okay, that's very interesting. So is this different than the case in, like near Sutter Street in the Historic District, where it was like a business in that case? So the reason the appeal was allowed to go in that case is because anyone in Folsom could be a patron of that business. And therefore it kind of like affects them indirectly, whereas in this case it was more of like a residential thing? Was that
my understanding is it's a residential lot. It was interesting because it sounded like, based on the applicant's arguments, that there was a lot that could go into this, but because this is an applicant who has been before the city council before and has mentioned some of those other topics, he intentionally focused on some areas that he hasn't covered rather than some of the areas he's already discussed with the city council. So it sounds like there's a lot that could have gone into this, but largely this one was different in the sense that it seemed like the city council took it more as that issue was standing that I mentioned. So they were almost, I don't want to say more dismissive of the claims, but it felt like whether or not the applicant even had the right to be there was more in contention rather than that the business that was discussed in a previous meeting.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. So, I guess I'm kind of curious then why the appeal for the business got as far as it did, because I would assume that kind of under the same circumstances, that because there was no like residential stuff around the building, and it wasn't like another business owner that was bringing an appeal for the what is it called? It was UCFB, right? Was the name? Uncle Charlie's Firehouse.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was UCFB that was the defendant, I guess, the applicant, for the project itself, and the appellant was someone who felt like they shouldn't get a CEQA exemption. So I guess in that case,
that one felt like a lot more specific to certain issues with regards to the business. Like for one of the examples, it had to do with like the time that they would be brewing, the smell and all that. Whereas this one felt a little bit more conceptual in the presentation. Interesting.
Okay. I guess that's good to know though, that there is like a filtering process at each stage. Because I guess one fear with these type of processes is that if the bar is sort of so low for an appeal that it kind of detracts developers from doing business of any kind, or even contractors from doing any sort of business, which probably like drives up the contracting rates overall, and ultimately makes things unsustainable.
Well, I mean, it factors into the uncertainty costs. So
yeah,
for non-economists, basically the idea that, well, if this could go either way, that'll end up adding to the bottom line, because then you have to account for more risk.
Exactly. Yeah, they have to account for the time that their civil engineers have to go in front of city council, and they have to get paid probably overtime and things like that, and they have to defend the case, and even then, even after they pay the overtime and make all this case, it might not go through. Yeah. So it's ultimately like a huge gamble. But then again, on the other side, I feel like if appeals are denied almost too frequently, then nobody has any incentive to sort of appeal something. Yeah. There's sort of like the inertia kind of goes the opposite way, and maybe developers or commercial landlords or something get far too much power. So I don't know. I'm very, I guess, empathetic to the balance that the city council has to play. Yeah, I don't really have much else to add to that, but it's interesting to see this as a recurring issue, especially the CEQA thing. I didn't know that CEQA would be such a such a common thread in these kind of issues. I wonder just to some extent if it's used as a cudgel by some, versus if there is actually some kind of merit to updating this, kind of like antiquated set of, not restrictions, but these sort of antiquated checks on like how healthy is a business for its environment. You know what I mean?
CEQA is such a big topic that we'll talk about, especially at the local level. It's super impactful here in Folsom. It's something that's been around for decades, older than us by far. There's a lot you can talk about in terms of the intention of its creation, because that's something you can dispute. That I took an environmental law class on this at one point, so I used to be very well versed, but I think if we were to talk about this more, we should bring in like an expert, someone who actually practices law currently. And to that point of there being a lot of perceived problems with it, there's a ton of discussion, especially at the state level, on different ways that CEQA can be amended. That being said, still in progress in the legislature, but I think that almost could be its own series. Like, there's so much to talk about with CEQA. I think we'll do an episode at some point.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, like some things I'd be kind of curious about is it seems like a lot of what CEQA lacks maybe is a level of clarity. So they don't go into specifics. For example, they'll make these like kind of broad statements of like if like a business changes the structure significantly, then it merits it does not merit an exemption from the CEQA inspections and stuff like that. And like you have to wonder on some level, like, okay, like what did they mean by significant changes? Like they probably meant, okay, if you like tear down a wall and you like extend the square footage, like that seems kind of obvious. But it's like, okay, if I instead of having movable tables, what if I bolt tables to the ground? Is that changing the foundation? If I redo the flooring, I mean that's technically part of like the structure to some extent. If I put up rafters, if I change the electrical work, is that changing like the structure of the building? So it feels like very unclear, and it kind of lends itself to a lot of this like very opinionated debate. Like it really just depends on how a particular city council or a particular appellant or a particular applicant interprets all of these different CEQA exemptions, and ultimately what they make of it in the moment, which is like, again, like adds to the uncertainty. Like you don't know who's going to interpret it, how, who's going to be on the city council by the time your project gets approved, and so why gamble on that?
Well, that's one of the great I guess, tug of wars, if you will, with the law,
Mhm.
where if you go the route of defining things super vague, like precisely, like saying, oh, only in this circumstance, like for these things, you'll need people who constantly will update the law as new things come about. You can get super into the minutia. You're going to need a lot of experts. So you can argue that that could be really like cost intensive, time consuming to do that legally, and very complicated in terms of like even interpreting the law. Even though it's more clear, like there's a lot that you'll have to understand. Versus the trade-off being, if you make it vague enough, it can be something that you don't necessarily have to update as often, and can be interpreted with the times, and accommodate more change faster than the legislative process can.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I'm personally for like an automatic sunset clause. Like I honestly think we should have like an amendment that like sunsets every law on the books, such that you have to continually approve it. I don't know. I just think that would actually be better. I also would like some sort of like meta constraints of like, you know, all of your laws can only take up like 1,000 pages and 12-point font, like double spaced or something like that. Because then that would force people to like reconsolidate laws, like get rid of ones that, you know, aren't really relevant or high priority, and keep the ones that seem to last the test of time. But I don't know. Those are sort of in the abstract. But I don't know. I think some sort of sunsetting of laws seems prudent in most cases, because things evolve and change, and you know, each successive generation should have a chance to like kind of opt in or opt out. Like that's sort of the simplest decision you can make. Like they don't have to like rewrite the law from scratch, but if they just want to, you know, opt in, opt out, like I feel like it's a better way to do it.
Personally, I think I need to hear more to be convinced of that. I lean against it, but I mean that's, I think, diverging too far from the agenda for this week. So, any final thoughts?
No, honestly, it was I think it was a slower city council meeting than I anticipated. But yeah, I don't really have any additional thoughts.
Okay, me neither. Thank you all for joining us, and see you next week.
Bye.